On this day, I would like to dedicate and honor this sermon to Reverend Edwin for all his years of ministry and service to the Lord and to God's people. When is it right? As I read this week's lesson and came up with the title, When is it right? I realized that many, if not most, of Jesus' sayings and parables are really ways of getting us to ask ourselves, when are things right? When is it or is it not right to do something? The story of the crippled woman, like several of the other healing stories and of all healing, have the assumption that goes with them in order to get direction or guidance from any of them, that we have to believe that what Jesus has said counts, and that somehow it might have meaning for our life. I think there are three actions taking place in this story. First, we have the healing of the woman who has had a spirit come over her and crippled her for some 18 years. And then the second action, where the synagogue leaders are reprimanding Jesus for healing on the Sabbath and for those actually seeking healing on the Sabbath. And lastly, Jesus' scorning of the leaders as hypocrites, who they would help their animals on the Sabbath, but not this woman. This story typifies the struggle, I think, that each of us makes when we use our faith faculties or values to choose when is it right to do something or not, and who or what rules do we follow. I'd like to start with two definitions of what it means to be Christian, because in a sense our decisions are often made by the stories and messages we've been given by the Christian faith. And the first definition comes from Dietrich Bonhoeffer, but you need to know who he is in order to understand his definition. Dietrich Bonhoeffer would come to the United States to teach as a theologian in a seminary in New York City. But then he knew of all the heinous acts that Hitler was committing, and he felt in his heart he had to go back and try and stop him. So this is how he defines a Christian. It is not some religious act that makes a Christian what they are, but participation in the suffering of God in the light of the world. I see this definition having to do with not just how God might carry things out or want us to carry it out, but in relation to the reality of what it is to live this human existence. Now, the second definition is more closely connected, I think, to the Christ of Christianity. And this is a preacher, a famous preacher, Henry Ward Beecher, and this is what he wrote. Everyone whose life and disposition is Christ-like, no matter how heretical the denomination be to which they belong, is Christian. How many here have either read, seen, heard when someone says, well, they're not a real Christian? This is a stronger stance, I think, than the first one, because Jesus Christ really, and I don't think people like to hear this, is a radical. He's a radical in terms of placing an individual's needs above or over a government or a principality. Jesus was constantly in prayer and asking for guidance, speaking to God. But nonetheless, he made his choices. When is it right? And it held extreme consequence for him. Now here Jesus is standing in the holy temple on the Sabbath day, and he calls to the woman, which is slightly different than other stories, because usually it's the person who first tries to get Jesus' attention. But here Jesus is the one saying, I need to reach out. I need to help her. And he takes the initiative. I've often wondered about this because I thought I'd like to be there and to know what exactly did it mean by a spirit? What form was it? Was it something that was a mental anguish or an emotional crippling or a physical crippling? Was it self-inflicted or caused by some torment in her life? But then I realized that the bigger meaning was in his simply taking action and reaching out to her. When is it right? When I lived in Florida as a teenager, I heard of a wonderful example of someone who struggled with when is it right. And this was a pastor of one of those huge mega churches, like 6,000 members. And it was a Sunday morning, and the pastor was getting prepared, getting ready for service, and he was sort of like one of those frantic flying around. It was almost like a big production, and there came a tapping at the door. And there stood a man, dirty, poorly clothed, and by his behavior, on all accounts, perhaps was a drug addict. "Pastor, could I talk with you for a moment?" The pastor replies, "Oh no, I'm sorry, service starts in 2 minutes," and he starts walking away. And the man yells after him, "But pastor, I need some help." And the pastor is walking, and he's thinking, and he's walking, and then he stops. And he turns around, and he goes back to his office, and he spends nearly the next hour trying to get started in helping this man. Now, I don't know what fully happened in that service, where there might have been 3,000 or 4,000 people thinking the pastor was going to appear. But 5 years later, fast forward, the same pastor of the mega church passes by a fellow clergyman. And the clergyman's wearing a clerical collar, and the man speaks to him, and through their conversation, the pastor learns that it is the same man who got the help from him, goes on to attend seminary, and is just about to begin his ministry. When is it right? Jesus tells the woman she is free from her bonds, but I wonder if we can't hear that in whatever situation we find ourselves, that he is talking to all of us. You are free from your bonds. And that we need to look at what that looks like in our day and in our time. Here, back then, was a system, an organization, the synagogue, that was telling Jesus that what he was doing was wrong. At that time, he was in the wrong, or at least he had the timing wrong. Now, I'm not fooled for 1 minute to think that that pastor in the earlier story didn't get tremendous flack and heat for not showing up for worship service. Going to great lengths, preachers are creatures of habit. How many here that come regularly seek out a certain area or pew in the sanctuary? All right. So you get a little distressed if someone's sitting there, don't you? So multiply that by about 1,000 in terms of what happened that day. Now, Jesus was in his time, in a sense, facing the same thing. He did something that was a change, that was extreme, and the rabbis just could not understand or fathom it. And we hear about it, actually, in Matthew 12, a reply that he illustrates, not just in this one, but I want to share with you. He's trying to teach them that you do this all the time, whether you acknowledge it or not. And this is what he says. "What man of you, if he has one sheep, and it falls into the pit on the Sabbath, will not lay hold of it and lift it out? Of how much more value is a person than a sheep? For it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath." So in a sense, he was trying to use their own laws and see how they may need to bend. They cannot be so fixed. So he puts before us that struggle of mercy being greater than the law itself. That God does not want people to suffer. And if there are things that we can do, even if it means breaking a law, that we need to be willing to do that. Now, the rabbi had a tremendous investment in the system. And so they talked directly to the people, and they, yes, were talking to Jesus, but they wanted to make sure that the people wouldn't follow him. No work on the Sabbath. No gray. Clearly it's a black and white line. When is it right? And I thought about this in relation to the United Church of Christ is probably one of the denominations that gets pretty close to the line of choosing to break the law, and sometimes even doing it when it means caring for and helping people who are in need. And to some people that's very distressing. You know, we keep everything in its place. When I was first in seminary, when I learned about this, I had it drilled into me, separation of church and state. You know, faith should never be in the public light. You should never, just keep it separate. I remember getting warned by a trustee one Sunday, came to the parsonage, knocked on the door. Pastor Sara, just thought I should tell you, don't ever preach that kind of political sermon again, or you're done. So, to my chagrin, in the national church, we went, and to find out that there's an advocate who works and lobbies in Washington, D.C., I was like, what a discrepancy. So I had in my heart, what's right? Which is right? And I'm like, maybe the point is, in our modern day world, just like back in Jesus' day, it was the temple, it was the synagogue, and that was the power and authority that he had to stand up to. But in our day, that if we're ever going to share what is the compassionate thing, what is the kind thing to do, part of it is understanding our legal system and having someone who represents Christian values. That it's not a bad thing to work toward amending or changing things. I'll give you an illustration. I'm appalled that anyone has to choose between medicine, in particular things that are life-threatening illnesses, and whether they'll eat or live. There's got to be something that we can do. But the only way you do that in modern times is to work with or through governmental agencies or insurance companies, and you change how they operate. So when is it right for Christians to say anything? Or do we just keep silent? We are always wrestling. When is it right? And Jesus would say that if it could change or help or heal people's lives, that is the definition of when it is right. But I'm not a fool. There could be a consequence. You could be jailed. You could be asked to leave. You could be removed from your church position. All of those are consequences. Now, at the end of the story, the writer says, when Jesus said this, all his opponents were put to shame, and the entire crowd was rejoicing at all the wonderful things that he was doing. Now, this was a reference to Jesus' ability to answer the rabbis using their own laws to help them to understand. But I suspect what it did is it made them very angry. He did what he thought needed to happen. This is a simple message. For Jesus was not doing this to anger the leaders, but to help that one person. And I guess that's the overriding clue of when is it right. To ask ourselves, are we doing this because we really want or need to help that person? Or is it to prove some point or to fulfill our own need? That is a strong message that comes through in Christianity, I believe, that the individual does count, that you count, that I count, exactly because we exist. Some might say that's why Christianity and democracy and the values have always gone together, because the ordinary individual does matter. They are closely linked, because an individual needs to be above a system. Jesus' actions focused on helping that woman to heal. In my own life, one of the places that I got stymied was trying to help someone get off where they needed help, and they had been on having social service needs and subsidies, and I can still hear the woman saying, but Pastor Sara, every time I get my head just above water, and I go from earning $11 to $13, then they take away some of the assistance, and I'm back down below water. So in a sense, the system is broken because it doesn't let the person get their foot up enough to be able to stand. So that's the difficulty, is that we still have to see people and not just numbers and whole systems. Because I know for me, one of the things is when I'm detached that way, I can almost be very casual or even callous. But if you tell me it's happening to Eileen or to Sue or to people I visited in their homes who tell me that they alternate days of their medication so that it will last, so that they can buy their food for the week, then I say, what can I do? What can we do? So this is what Jesus was facing. He had a woman that he could help, and he knew he'd get in trouble. But he said, I must do this. I must help her. When is it right? This question, more often than not, will face us in times of war, or crisis, or famine, or some kind of struggle. When will we act, and when will we refrain from acting? Our text looks at the fact that the crowd begins to rejoice, and that makes the powers that be anxious. They don't like it. When is it right? When is it right that we should act? There is a time when there is need, but there can be repercussion. And the line that I want to share with you, we don't see it that often. It's only when new members join. But it makes sense now that I've read the scripture. And we say, when someone joins a Christian community, the cost and joy of discipleship. And that's what this is. At some point in some time, there may be a cost to being a disciple. Because we choose to do what is right, even in the sight of authorities who may say, no. I offer to you, may each of us know sometime that we will be that person who needs to ask ourselves, and it will be God-given, when is it right, and should I act? Thanks be to God. Amen.
And when the sunset comes, my prayer would be this one, that you might pick me up and notice that I am just